Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Everstream Analytics Weekly Supply Chain Overview webinar to help you get in front of what's ahead with potential weather disruptions in your business and supply chain networks. My name is Mark Russo, Chief Science Officer, and joining me is John Davis, Chief Meteorologist, who will start things off here with what's ahead for this week, starting off here in North America. So with that, let me hand things over to John.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Good day, everybody. So as we look at the upcoming week, we have no major supply chain disruptions across the U.S. And because of that, this week's risk score is green, meaning that we have no significant issues that would have ramifications on a large scale within the supply chain network across the U.S. So let's go into some of the details. And as we normally do, we'll first take a look at the major cargo airports across North America. This is something we haven't seen in a while. We actually have one of the major cargo airports that is scoring red, and that is up in Anchorage, Alaska. We'll take a look at the reason for that and the timing of it in just a moment. But that is the only supply chain hub of cargo airports, major ports, and intermodal hubs that is scoring red over the next week's time frame. So we have one high-risk supply chain asset across North America going through the next week. Now, as for the major ports out there, we have no high-risk ports anywhere across North America. And as for the intermodal hubs, the same basic story with mainly open weather, mainly green, no disruptions. We have a few areas that are scoring a moderate risk. Some of those are in the southeast. Some of those are in the southwest. The southeast, that's due to some heavier rainfall over the next 3 or 4 days across that region. And in the southwest, that's actually due to a severe weather threat here today across those locales. The fact that we have one asset scoring red, high risk, up in Anchorage, let's take a look at that situation up in Anchorage at the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. So as we look ahead, there's a very distinct time frame of high risk, and it comes down to a snow event across that region. And if we look at the specifics of this snow event, it begins later on during the day on October 11th and continues through much of the day on the 12th. And it's due to snow with some winds across those areas. So that there is the snow zone, and that is the time frame that is scoring high risk. Now, the accumulations do not look excessive, but for this time of year, certainly enough to disrupt operations across that area. It looks like right now about 5 to 7 inches of snow with some pretty stiff winds are expected across the region during that time frame. It's not a long period of time. This is not a long duration event. Rather, it's a little bit over, 24 hours. And again, later on the 11th, during the day on the 12th, that is the high risk zone where we likely will have some disruptions due to this snow event across areas of southern Alaska. And again, the Ted Stevens International Airport is one of the biggest cargo airports around the globe. If we broaden things out and look at the big picture across North America, this is the snowfall forecast over the next 7 days. So this is much more of a regional situation. Some areas of Alaska will begin to get into some of the snow. Some areas of Western Canada, especially British Columbia, will get into the snow. But the heaviest accumulations look to be mainly in coastal locations across those locales, as we do have a feed of moisture that will be moving into the region. And it's the time of year where many times those feed of moistures can be in the form of snow. So this is not a huge blizzard and certainly an event that would disrupt things for many days on end. But to get some snow at this time of year is a pretty normal situation as we head into the second week of October. And that is exactly what we're going to see here coming up across those areas. Again, the only supply chain hub across North America that is scoring high risk is Anchorage. And again, that is coming up here on the 11th and 12th of October. As we look at some of the other regional issues out there across the US, again, these are minor isolated issues. This is nothing that widespread, but we do have a couple of risks out there, a couple of threats, if you will. As has been the case for quite some time, we continue to have enhanced fire threat. That is mainly going to be a situation across Montana over the next 4 or 5 days due to strong winds across that zone. Further south in Arizona, including the Phoenix area, we do have a slight risk of severe weather. In other words, some thunderstorms that may produce some strong gusty winds, possibly a bit of hail across those areas. But that is just today and tonight. The remainder of this week looks quiet across those areas of Arizona. And finally, across portions of the southeast, we do have some heavy rains coming in. This is a 3 or 4 day event. And because of that, we do have some flash flood watches across portions of Alabama, Georgia, and into the Florida panhandle due to these heavy rains, which in some areas will likely be on the order of 4 to 7 inches coming up from now through the end of the week. Again, not a major inland flood event, but certainly enough that some isolated areas may have some issues with some standing water and some isolated flooding across the region between now and Friday. Finally, let's kind of wrap up with the tropical activity across the Atlantic basin, and it looks quiet. We've been very active lately across the Atlantic, but none of those strong storms in the Atlantic have caused any disruptions to any land areas, including the East Coast and certainly the Gulf Coast of the US. Of course, Sam was a very long-lived storm, or the most long-lived, strongest storm that we've ever seen across the Atlantic. But Sam is in the process of weakening and moving into the North Atlantic. And the only area that will have any impact on will be Iceland over the next 5 or 6 days. But for the US, quiet conditions. We do not see any development of any tropical activity over the next week's time frame. And so it looks quiet on the Gulf Coast, in Florida, and along the East Coast as we go through this upcoming week across the US. We still have October to get through and also early November, as we've seen during the past couple of years. But at least for the next week's time frame, looks like the tropics are active with no disruptive events expected across any portion of the US. Now let's go on to Mark with some of the global highlights. Mark?
Thank you very much, John. As we turn now to the main items of note around the world, certainly the vast majority of supply chain nodes are scoring low risk. That's true across much of Europe. That's true across much of Asia, as well as in South America, Africa, and Australia. We do want to cover just a few kind of regional areas of note where there is medium or even a few nodes that are at high risk. One of those areas we will focus on is Northwest Europe due to storminess. Second area is in around Vietnam and far southern China, and that is due to tropical threat as well as heavy rainfall and flooding. And then lastly, we do want to cover the Northern Pacific, where stronger winds here could disrupt shipping across the region. And obviously with the ongoing shipping delays and port congestion here, we're now beginning to get into the season where stronger winds and rough seas across the North Pac can help to amplify those issues. So provide a few more specifics on that here coming up. Let's first talk about the details here with Europe, where we initially discussed this predictive risk in our 5-minute forecast. So just kind of expanding on that here today, we are tracking several nodes across Northwest Europe that are at medium or high risk of disruptions. And that is due to a combination of stronger wind gusts across the region, kind of in around the UK, North Sea region, and even extending a little bit offshore there, France. Also, heavier rainfall in portions of Northwest Europe. That is where at least the a higher number of medium risk supply chain nodes are located, but there's also the secondary area of heavier rainfall in and around Italy, and the Balkan states here. But even some of the heavier rains look to stay offshore, and with the exception of Milan International Airport, the rest of the nodes here are scoring green, low risk, and the rainfall is not significant enough. But all in all, Northwest Europe, you can see the higher number of medium risk hubs. And there is one high risk hub, and that is the port of Rotterdam, which again is Europe's largest seaport. The disruptions due to wind, choppy seas, and even some heavy precipitation, that is ongoing. It really started over the past couple of days across Northwest Europe and looks to continue, especially in around the Netherlands and across the eastern portion of the North Sea region, still throughout the remainder of the day today and on into tomorrow. Looking at the specific risk timeline in our platform for the Port of Rotterdam, that medium to high risk will extend all the way through much of the day here tomorrow. And the highest risk window actually starts later on today. It then is in place for about 12 hours. So that is the time frame where there is a high risk of significant vessel delays, as well as potential for closure of the port at that time. And that is due to very strong wind gusts, some potentially in excess of 80 kilometers per hour. And in fact, the peak gusts look to be around 83 kilometers per hour coming up at about tomorrow here. And at least local time for the Rotterdam area, that would be around 7 a.m. Across the region. This 12 a.m. is more so here on U.S. time, but about 6-7 hours later, that is the time from a time zone standpoint, and that is at least the main window or time frame of a peak wind gust. Once we get to October 7th, though, you can see winds are forecast to significantly relax, and that should begin to resume more kind of normal operations there at the port. And we don't see any other kind of repeat of those stronger winds and stormy conditions, looking out even all the way into next week. Our second area of note we want to focus on is in the South China Sea region, with emphasis on Vietnam and far southern China. And that risk is due to a more active pattern setting up in terms of tropical activity across the Western Pacific region. In fact, we've started to see the development of some just early organization of waves of low pressure across the South China Sea, even on into the Western Pacific. We have two invest areas. The one of note right now is 92W, which looks to be actually will develop into Tropical Storm Lion Rock coming up over the next few days as this wave slowly tracks towards Vietnam and Hainan province there of China. In fact, we have issued our watchtower alert for the risk of heavy rainfall and flooding for this zone that includes much of central and northern Vietnam and extending into Hainan province in far southern China. And again, that risk zone and the threat of disruptions will be starting tomorrow, October 6th, and continue through the 10th. Now, we do have one major port that is within that zone, and that is the port of Da Nang in Vietnam. It is Vietnam's third largest port, and it lies at the mouth of the Han River, which is the economic corridor connecting Vietnam with Laos, Thailand, and Burma. So regional important area, and there is a high risk of disruptions at the port, whether that's disruptions of vessel movement in and out of the port, and even the potential for closure of the port coming up, actually starting here tomorrow, and again, extending all the way through October the 7th. That is the time frame of highest risk. Now, with Tropical Storm Lion Rock, we're not expecting the storm to produce any kind of exceptionally strong winds, but there will be this period where winds could exceed 50 kilometers per hour, so not expecting any kind of major damage. But actually, the biggest issue is due to precipitation, where there will be very heavy rainfall that even over the next few days looks to accumulate to potentially over 200 millimeters. In fact, that is over 8 inches of rainfall in a rather short amount of time. And that is the main impact here at the port of Da Nang, but even not just at the ports, but for much of central northern Vietnam and into Hainan province of far southern China, with a multi-day window of heavy rainfall that does increase the heavy rainfall or increase the flood risk across the region, and enough to cause disruptions in logistics, or on the minor to moderate category, but also the same is true for business operations across the region. Our third item of note here today we want to focus on is the Northern Pacific, where there is an increased risk of additional shipping delays across the region due to stronger wind gusts that will be in place just offshore Japan, all the way eastward to the western coast of North America. As you see here in our map of strongest wind gusts expected over the next 7 days on our platform, you can see wind gusts will exceed over 90 kilometers per hour, with peak gusts above 130 kilometers per hour near the international date line. So kind of just west of the Aleutians there in Alaska. But this does cover some of the key shipping routes across the North Pacific. So for any shipping lanes here, certainly in your accounts here, could be potentially showing medium or even high risk of disruptions for shipments along these lanes extending from in around East Asia all the way to North America. And again, this is the season or time of year where we begin to see stronger storm systems and ultimately an increase in rough seas across the region to cause delays, but also increase the risk of issues with some of the vessels. Last year, as we talked about in one of our key webinars a few weeks ago, last season did feature numerous container losses across the North Pacific due to an abundance of stormy activity. And we're now starting out that container loss season again, potentially, and a lot of similarities as a year ago in terms of the setup for storminess across the North Pacific. So that's going to continue to be an item to watch here as we go through the winter months up ahead. But we're starting to see that right now, and that will even increase over time, especially with some of the strongest storms moving across the region. Next, let's talk about temperatures here in North America to wrap things up. And as we look ahead here this week, the story continues to be unseasonably mild temperatures, especially across much of the central and eastern portions of the country. Now, the western portion of the US, especially on the West Coast and up into Western Canada, they have begun to cool down, so they will not be involved with the anomalous warmth that we'll see here across central and eastern US, business operation regions, as well as the shipping lanes across the region. So still kind of a taste of summer across portions of the central and eastern US. That will start to change as we go into next week, not as much across the eastern half of the country, but across the western half of the country. We're beginning to see the intrusion of colder air across much of the western US coming up, and that will begin to enhance protection from freeze requirements for any interstates and routes connecting nodes across the western portion of the country. Now, at this time, we don't see any eastward movement of that into the central and eastern US, but really that looks confined to the western US, especially in some of the higher elevations. But with this pattern here setting up for next week, October 12th through 18th, that will begin to expand the spatial extent of freezing temperatures across the western US. And in fact, not only are we going to see more widespread freezing temperatures, but there will be even pockets that drop down into the teens in some of the higher elevations of the Central Rockies, as well as up into Western Canada as well. So we're beginning to ramp up the protect from freeze season here. And at least initially, as we go through this early to middle portion of October, that is going to be focused more so across the western portion of the country, and a pocket here in far eastern Canada, but that will not be true across the central and eastern US. So as a result of this, looking at specifically the interstates and the number of miles that will need protection from freeze for temperature sensitive products. We do have one interstate, that is I-70, where we are calculating 53 miles of temperatures below 15 degrees coming up over the next couple of weeks, which again, that is primarily focused next week. So that looks to be the coldest lane. So if you do have any shipments there scheduled to track on I-70 or even some of the rail routes there near I-70, then certainly enhanced PFF requirements will be needed. But even for medium risk here, so interstates that will see temperatures below freezing, but not quite to 15, we are tracking 9 interstates here. Again, focused in the Western US. That is an increase of 4 from a week ago. And that is our latest metrics here in terms of medium risk category. Still, the highest number of interstates across the US is in the low category, and that is 60 interstates, which again focused across the central and eastern US. So those are the latest highlights from a temperature and now PFF standpoint. So wrapping things up here, again, with what's ahead this week, all in all, a quiet week is expected with only some regional items of note. And in fact, as John noted, the only North America high-risk supply chain node is Anchorage, Alaska, and Ted Stevens International Airport due to snow activity there coming up. Elsewhere around the US, just some regional issues, potential flooding in portions of the southeastern US, potential severe weather across areas of the southwestern US, and then there's the ongoing wildfire risk across portions of the western US, as well as up into Canada as well. And lastly, across the globe, 3 main areas of note: Northwest Europe, potential wind disruptions for another 2 days or so. As for tropical risks, it's Vietnam and southern China that has the highest risk here coming up, especially in around the port of Da Nang, Vietnam, over the next few days. And then lastly, if you do have any shipments here scheduled to track across the North Pacific, be aware of very stormy conditions coming up over the next 7 days that could further delay shipments across and vessel movement across the North Pacific. Before we wrap things up, we did have a question here come in, and be happy to answer that here. The question is, has the low located near the Canary Islands over the summer, rather than closer to Bermuda, had an impact of guiding Atlantic hurricanes out to sea instead of into the US? Good question, and let me pass that over to John to answer it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it really comes down to the upper level environment that has been responsible for steering the storms and keeping them in the Atlantic rather than not moving them westward toward the US or Mexico into the Gulf or East Coast. It really is an upper level feature that's responsible for that. And that has been in place over the past month or so. That's why all of these strong storms over the past month have moved off of Africa and then stayed in the Atlantic, and they curve northward and die out in the northern portion of the Atlantic. Now, prior to the past month, the overall upper level pattern was totally different. That's why we did have a lot of landfalling hurricanes. Ida was the most famous one, but if you look at Henri, or we look at Mindy or Nicholas, we had numerous landfalling storms across the U.S. Prior to that situation. So this pattern that you mentioned, a really good observation. It's an upper level pattern, and yes, the kind of troughing that we're seeing, and that troughing is basically just to the west of the Canary Islands. That is forcing the storms, or picking them up, as we call it. Moving from Africa then up into the North Atlantic. That feature has been there for about the past month or so, but only the past month. And that's why earlier in the season, we did have a lot of landfalling hurricanes, because that overall feature was not there back in August and the very early portion of September. So the past month, we've been safe really due to that feature here coming up. And it looks to remain in place at least about during the next week or 10 days before it does look like it will begin to diminish here thereafter. But an excellent question. And, for the individuals out there, any questions that come up, the questions are great. So always feel free to do. But thank you so much for the question. And if you need anything else, any more information, please feel free to let us know.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining today's Everstream Analytics Weekly Supply Chain Overview webinar. Again, for more details within your network here, again, log into your Everstream account. And as John mentioned, again, any questions, feel free to ask here as we go through the webinar, or you can send us an email or contact us after the webinar as well, or if you're watching a recording of it. So don't hesitate there. And again, we appreciate everyone's questions. Happy to answer them. And also, again, if you also would like to learn more about our solutions, or request a specific demo here, again, please reach out to us. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day and the rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody, and you're welcome.